cabin door slammed shut behind Dorothy Thomas as Kenneth Flores drew her inside, his weathered hands trembling against the rough wood. The lantern light flickered across his scarred face, revealing eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty, yet held something she had never expected to find in a pirate captain: tenderness. "I haven't known a woman since I left port 3 years ago," he whispered, his voice breaking like waves against stone. "I thought I'd forgotten how to be gentle." Dorothy's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself against the cabin wall, feeling the ship rock beneath them while cannon fire echoed in the distance. The naval vessel pursuing them had found their hiding place among the coral reefs, and she knew this might be their last moment together before the battle that would determine their fate. His fingers traced the air near her face, not quite touching, as if she might disappear like morning mist. "You changed everything the moment you stepped aboard my ship." The memory of how she had arrived here crashed over her like a rogue wave. 6 months ago, she had been standing on the dock in Port Royal, clutching a letter that would destroy her life forever. Her husband's debts had consumed everything they owned, and the creditors were coming for her father's shipping business. She had nowhere to run, no family to turn to, and winter was approaching, with its promise of cold death for those without shelter. That was when Kenneth Flores and his crew had sailed into port, their black flag furled, but their reputation preceding them like thunder before lightning. The townspeople whispered that Captain Flores was different from other pirates. He never harmed women or children, never burned churches, and always left enough cargo for merchant ships to limp home. Some called him soft, others called him calculating. Dorothy had simply called him Hermione Hope. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. She had approached him in the tavern where he sat alone, nursing a cup of rum while his crew celebrated their latest prize. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, but Dorothy had walked straight to his table and placed her father's shipping ledgers before him. "I need passage to the Caribbean," she had said, her voice steadier than her hands. "I can pay you with information about merchant routes and naval patrol schedules." Kenneth had looked up at her with those same dark eyes that now watched her in his cabin. "What makes you think I won't just take your information and leave you here?" "Because," Dorothy had replied, meeting his gaze without flinching, "you're not that kind of pirate." He had studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn dress and desperate expression. "And what kind of pirate am I?" "The kind who still remembers what it feels like to need help." That conversation had changed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Kenneth had agreed to take her aboard, but not as a passenger. She would work for her passage, helping his navigator Scott Jimenez plot courses and assisting the ship's doctor, Frank Reyes, with the wounded. Dorothy had accepted without hesitation, grateful for any chance to escape the crushing weight of her circumstances. The first weeks aboard the Serpent's Dream had been a careful dance of avoidance and observation. Dorothy kept to her duties, learning the rhythm of ship life, while the crew slowly accepted her presence. Kenneth maintained his distance, speaking to her only when necessary, but she often felt his eyes following her as she moved about the deck. It was Frank Reyes who first told her about the captain's past. The grizzled doctor had been tending a sailor's infected wound when he mentioned that Kenneth had once been a merchant captain himself, before the war took everything he loved. "Lost his ship, his cargo, and his wife to a British naval attack," Frank had said, his voice low. "They claimed his vessel was carrying a contraband, but it was just grain and medicine for the colonies. Burned everything and left him for dead on a beach in Jamaica." Dorothy had felt something shift in her chest at those words. She understood now why Kenneth's eyes held such carefully controlled pain, why he never spoke of his life before piracy, why he treated captured merchant crews with unexpected mercy. The turning point came during a storm that nearly claimed them all. Hurricane winds had driven them far off course, and the ship was taking on water faster than the crew could bail it out. Dorothy had worked alongside the men for 18 hours straight, her hands bleeding from rope burns as she helped secure the rigging and patch holes in the hull. When the storm finally broke, Kenneth had found her collapsed on the deck, exhausted but still conscious. He had carried her to his cabin and tended her wounds with his own hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses earned from years of handling sword and rope. "Why did you stay on deck?" he had asked as he bandaged her torn palms. "You could have taken shelter below." Because this ship is my home now, Dorothy had answered, and you don't abandon your home when it needs you. Something had changed in Kenneth's expression at those words. The careful walls he had built around his heart had begun to crack, letting in light for the first time in years. From that night forward, their relationship had deepened with each passing day. Kenneth began seeking out her company, asking her opinion on navigation decisions, and sharing stories of the places they visited. Dorothy found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, when the rest of the crew was asleep and they could speak freely without the weight of captain and crew member between them. She learned that he read poetry in 3 languages, that he had once dreamed of exploring the Amazon River, that he still wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck. He discovered that she could calculate wind speed by watching cloud formations, that she had taught herself to read by studying her father's shipping contracts, that she hummed lullabies her mother had sung when she was afraid. The intimacy between them grew slowly, built on shared watches under star-filled skies and quiet moments when words were unnecessary. Dorothy began to understand that Kenneth's reputation for mercy came not from weakness, but from a deep well of compassion that piracy had not been able to drain. He showed her the maps he kept of safe harbors where escaped slaves could find freedom, the coded letters he received from merchants, grateful for his protection of their smaller vessels. The world sees only the black flag, he had told her one night as they stood at the ship's rail, watching phosphorescent waves break against the hull. But sometimes the only way to fight injustice is to become what others fear. Dorothy had reached out then, covering his scarred hand with hers. I see more than the flag, she had whispered. I see the man who gives half his prize money to widows in port towns. I see the captain who risks his life to rescue sailors from sinking ships, even enemy vessels. Kenneth had turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight on water. What else do you see? I see a man who's forgotten how to forgive himself, Dorothy had replied. But I also see a man worth saving. Their first kiss had happened during the calm after another storm, when the danger had passed and they were alone in the chart room. It had been soft and hesitant, flavored with salt air and the promise of something neither had dared hope for. Kenneth had pulled away first, his forehead resting against hers as he struggled with emotions he had buried for years. I can't offer you the life you deserve, he had said, his voice rough with longing. I'm a wanted man, Dorothy. There's no future in loving a pirate. Then don't ask me to love a pirate, she had replied, her hands framing his face. Ask me to love Kenneth Flores, the man who reads poetry by candlelight and dreams of rivers he's never seen. That night had been the first time he had brought her to his cabin, not as captain to crew member, but as a man to the woman who had somehow found her way past all his defenses. They had talked until dawn, sharing stories and fears and hopes they had never spoken aloud. But their happiness had been fragile, threatened by the constant danger of their chosen life. Other pirates viewed Kenneth's mercy as weakness and his protection of Dorothy as a liability. Naval forces had increased their patrols, making every port of call a risk, and there were whispers among the crew that the captain's attention was divided, that his judgment was compromised by his feelings for the woman who had changed everything. The crisis had come just 3 days ago, when they encountered another pirate vessel flying the colors of Captain Jack Harris, a brutal man known for his cruelty to prisoners and his hatred of Kenneth's more civilized approach to piracy. Jack had demanded that Kenneth prove his loyalty to the Brotherhood by allowing his crew to have their way with Dorothy, claiming that no true pirate would let sentiment interfere with the crew morale. Kenneth's refusal had been immediate and absolute, but it had cost them dearly. Jack had spread word through the pirate network that Kenneth Flores had gone soft, that he was no longer worthy of respect or alliance. Worse, he had shared their location with the British Navy, hoping to see both Kenneth and Dorothy captured or killed. Now the naval ship HMS Retribution was closing in, its guns trained on the Serpent's Dream, while Kenneth's crew prepared for what might be their final battle. Dorothy could hear the shouted orders on deck, the scrape of cutlasses being sharpened, the prayers whispered by men who knew they might not see another sunset. But in this moment, in the privacy of Kenneth's cabin, the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the love they had found against all odds. If we don't survive this, Kenneth said, his hands finally settling on her shoulders, I need you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me back something I thought was lost forever. Dorothy reached up to touch the chain around his neck, feeling the weight of his first wife's ring against her fingers. She would have wanted you to be happy, she said softly. She would have wanted you to love again. Kenneth's eyes filled with tears he had held back for years. I was afraid that loving you meant betraying her memory. Love isn't betrayal, Dorothy whispered. Love is the only thing that makes us truly alive. The sound of cannon fire erupted across the water, shaking the ship and rattling the windows of the cabin. Kenneth's head snapped toward the door, his captain's instincts warring with his desire to stay in this moment forever. I have to go, he said, but his feet remained planted on the cabin floor. Dorothy nodded, understanding the weight of command that rested on his shoulders. I know, but Kenneth? She waited until his eyes met hers again. Come back to me. He kissed her, then with all the passion and desperation of a man who might be saying goodbye forever. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their hearts beating in rhythm with the thunder of approaching war. Kenneth straightened his coat and checked his pistols, transforming back into the pirate captain his crew needed him to be. But before he opened the door, he turned back to Dorothy one last time. Stay in the cabin, he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of command. Whatever happens, don't come on deck until I come for you. Dorothy wanted to argue, wanted to fight beside him as she had during the storm, but she understood that his ability to lead depended on knowing she was safe. I'll wait, she promised. Kenneth nodded and reached for the door handle, then paused. Dorothy, when this is over, when we're free of this threat, I want to ask you something important. Will you give me that chance? Her heart leaped at the implication in his words, but before she could answer, the ship shuddered under the impact of a cannonball, and Kenneth was gone, rushing toward the battle that would determine their fate. Dorothy sank onto his bunk, her hands shaking as the sounds of combat grew louder above her head. She could hear Joshua Rodriguez shouting orders to the gun crews, Scott Jimenez calling out range and bearing to the enemy ship, Frank Reyes preparing the surgery for wounded men who would soon need his care. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Dorothy pressed her ear to the cabin wall, trying to interpret the sounds of warfare that filtered down to her. The crash of cannon fire, the splintering of wood, the shouts of men fighting for their lives, and each sound made her heart race faster. Each moment of silence made her fear the worst. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Jack Harris's voice, bellowing across the water with savage glee. Give us the woman, Flores, and we might let some of your crew live. Dorothy's hands clenched into fists. She knew that Kenneth would never surrender her, but she also knew that his refusal might cost the lives of good men who had become her friends and protectors. The thought of Scott's young wife waiting for him in Tortuga, of Frank's grandchildren who depended on the money he sent home, of Joshua's dreams of buying a small farm and leaving piracy behind, made her stomach twist with guilt. The cabin door burst open and Dorothy's heart leaped with hope, but it wasn't Kenneth who stood in the doorway. It was one of Jack Harris's men, a scarred brute named William, who grinned at her with broken teeth. Well, well, he sneered, stepping into the cabin. The famous Dorothy Thomas. You've caused quite a stir in these waters, haven't you, love? Dorothy backed against the far wall, her mind racing as she searched for a weapon or escape route. Kenneth's sword hung on the wall just out of reach, and the windows were too small to climb through. Where is Captain Flores? She demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. William laughed, a harsh sound that made her skin crawl. Fighting for his life on deck, same as the rest of his crew. But don't you worry about old Kenneth. You'll be seeing him soon enough, right before we string him up from his own mast. He advanced toward her, his intentions clear in his leering expression. Dorothy grabbed a brass candlestick from Kenneth's desk, holding it like a club as she prepared to fight for her honor and her life. Stay back, she warned, raising the makeshift weapon. I won't go quietly. Oh, I was hoping you'd say that, William replied, drawing a wicked-looking knife from his belt. Jack said I could have some fun with you before we hand you over to the Navy. They're paying quite a bounty for Kenneth Flores's woman. The revelation hit Dorothy like a physical blow. The naval attack wasn't just about capturing pirates. Someone had put a price on her head specifically. Someone who knew about her relationship with Kenneth and wanted to use her as leverage against him. Before she could process this information fully, William lunged at her. Dorothy swung the candlestick with all her strength, catching him across the temple and sending him staggering backward. But the blow only enraged him, and he came at her again with his knife raised. Dorothy dodged to the side, but the cabin was too small for evasive maneuvers. William's blade sliced through the sleeve of her dress, missing her arm by inches. She scrambled across the bed, trying to reach Kenneth's sword, but William caught her ankle and dragged her back. "Enough games," he snarled, raising the knife for a killing blow. The cabin door exploded inward as Kenneth burst through, his cutlass already in motion. The blade caught William across the chest, sending him crashing into the cabin wall with a scream of pain and rage. Kenneth's face was a mask of fury unlike anything Dorothy had ever seen, his eyes blazing with the protective fire. "Touch her again and I'll feed you to the sharks piece by piece," Kenneth growled, his sword point at William's throat. William spat blood and laughed weakly. "Too late, Flores. Jack's already signaled the Navy. They know she's here, and they know what she means to you. Surrender now, and maybe they'll make it quick." Kenneth's jaw clenched, but his sword never wavered. "Get off my ship." "Or what? You'll kill an unarmed man? That's not your style, is it, Captain Mercy?" For a moment, Dorothy thought Kenneth might actually run the man through. The rage in his eyes was terrible to behold, and she could see the internal struggle between his principles and his desire for vengeance. But then his expression hardened into something even more frightening than anger. Cold, calculated determination. "You're right," Kenneth said quietly. "Killing you would be too easy." He grabbed William by the shirt and hauled him to his feet, then shoved him toward the door. "You can swim back to your captain and tell him that Kenneth Flores doesn't negotiate with cowards who hide behind the Navy's skirts." William stumbled out of the cabin, clutching his wounded chest. Kenneth slammed the door behind him and immediately turned to Dorothy, his hands running over her arms and face as he checked for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I'm fine," Dorothy assured him, though her hands were still shaking from the encounter. "Kenneth, he said the Navy is paying a bounty specifically for me. Someone wants me captured alive." Kenneth's expression darkened further. "Your husband's creditors. They must have convinced the authorities that you stole something when you fled Port Royal." Dorothy felt the pieces clicking into place. The shipping ledgers. They contained more than just route information. There were records of bribes paid to customs officials, evidence of smuggling operations that could implicate dozens of merchants. "And now they want you silenced before you can testify against them," Kenneth concluded grimly. He moved to the cabin windows, peering out at the battle still raging on deck. "We need to get you off this ship." "I won't leave you," Dorothy said firmly. "We face this together or not at all." Kenneth turned back to her, his eyes filled with love and desperation. "Dorothy, if they take you alive, they'll use you against me. I can't fight effectively knowing you're in danger." "Then don't fight," she said, moving to stand before him. "Let's run. Take the ship and sail for the horizon. We can disappear into the Caribbean, find an island where no one knows our names." Kenneth cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "I've been running for 3 years, love. I'm tired of running." "Then what do you want to do?" A smile played at the corners of Kenneth's mouth, the first she had seen since the battle began. "I want to remind Jack Harris and the British Navy why pirates fear the name Kenneth Flores." The plan Kenneth outlined was audacious to the point of madness, but Dorothy could see the brilliance in its simplicity. Instead of trying to outrun their pursuers, they would turn the trap against those who had set it. Kenneth's crew had been preparing for this moment without realizing it. For months, they had been gathering intelligence about naval patrol routes and pirate movements, information that Dorothy had helped organize and analyze. Now that knowledge would become their weapon. "Jack Harris thinks he's cornered us," Kenneth explained, as he gathered maps and charts from his desk. "But he's forgotten that I know these waters better than any man alive. There's a reef system about 2 miles north of here, invisible at high tide but deadly to any ship that doesn't know exactly where to navigate." Dorothy studied the charts, her mind already calculating angles and distances. You want to lead them into the reef. Both ships, Kenneth confirmed, Jack's vessel and the HMS Retribution. Let them destroy each other on the coral while we slip away through the channel I mapped last year. It was a dangerous gambit that required perfect timing and no small amount of luck. But as Dorothy looked into Kenneth's eyes, she saw the confidence of a man who had survived by trusting his instincts and the loyalty of his crew. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Kenneth's smile widened. "I need you to be the bait." The next few minutes passed in a blur of preparation and positioning. Kenneth's crew, battered but not broken by the battle, responded to his orders with the precision of men who had sailed together through countless storms. Scott Jimenez adjusted their course toward the hidden reef, while Joshua Rodriguez prepared the guns for one final devastating broadside. Dorothy took her position at the ship's rail, visible to both enemy vessels but protected by the angle of the deck. She could see Jack Harris on his quarterdeck, his face twisted with anticipation as he believed victory was within his grasp. The naval captain stood beside him, his uniform pristine despite the battle, his expression coldly professional. "There she is," Jack shouted across the water. "The woman who's caused all this trouble. Surrender her now, Flores, and we'll make your death quick." Kenneth appeared beside Dorothy, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture of support and solidarity. When he spoke, his voice carried across the water with the authority of a man who had never bowed to any authority but his own conscience. "Dorothy Thomas sails under my protection," he declared. "Any man who wants her will have to go through me first." Jack Harris's laughter was ugly and triumphant. "So be it. All ships, close for boarding. Time to end this once and for all." The two enemy vessels began to converge on the Serpent's Dream, their crews preparing grappling hooks and boarding axes. But Kenneth waited, his eyes fixed on the water ahead, watching for the telltale signs that would mark their salvation or their doom. "Now," he whispered to Scott, who spun the wheel hard to starboard. The Serpent's Dream turned sharply, her bow pointing directly toward what appeared to be open water. Jack Harris, sensing a desperate escape attempt, ordered his ship to follow while the naval vessel moved to cut off their retreat. The reef struck Jack Harris's ship first, the hidden coral teeth ripping through her hull like a giant's claws. The sound was tremendous, a grinding, splintering roar that could be heard for miles across the water. Jack's triumphant expression turned to horror as his vessel listed heavily to port, taking on water through a dozen breaches. The HMS Retribution, following too closely behind, had no time to change course. Her captain shouted desperate orders, but momentum and wind carried her forward into the same deadly embrace. The naval ship's heavier construction allowed her to survive the initial impact, but she was trapped now, her keel caught on the coral and her rudder damaged beyond repair. Kenneth's ship, guided by his intimate knowledge of these waters, threaded the needle between two coral heads with barely a foot of clearance on either side. Dorothy held her breath as they passed through the gap, feeling the ship shudder as barnacles scraped against her hull, but they emerged into deeper water unharmed. Behind them, chaos reigned. Jack Harris's crew was abandoning a ship, leaping into the churning water as their vessel broke apart on the reef. The naval ship was firing distress signals, her crew working frantically to free her from the coral trap before the rising tide drove her further onto the rocks. "Signal the other pirate crews in the area," Kenneth ordered Joshua. "Tell them there are British sailors in the water who need rescuing. Even Jack Harris's men deserve a chance to live." Dorothy looked at him with wonder and admiration. Even in victory, even after being betrayed and hunted, Kenneth's first thought was for the lives of his enemies. This was the man she had fallen in love with, the one who proved that honor and mercy could exist even in the darkest corners of the world. As the Serpent's Dream sailed toward the setting sun, Kenneth took Dorothy's hand and led her to the bow of the ship. The wind caught her hair, and for the first time in months, she felt truly free. "You said you wanted to ask me something," she reminded him, her heart racing with anticipation. Kenneth smiled and reached into his coat, pulling out a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring unlike any Dorothy had ever seen. It was made of silver and coral, set with a pearl that seemed to capture the light of the dying day. I had Scott make this while we were anchored off Nassau last month, Kenneth said, his voice soft with emotion. The coral came from the first reef where we kissed, and the pearl was a gift from a grateful merchant captain whose daughter we saved from slavers. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she understood the significance of each element. This wasn't just a ring, it was a symbol of their journey together, their shared values, and the love that had grown between them against all odds. Dorothy Thomas, Kenneth said, dropping to one knee on the deck of his ship while his crew watched with broad smiles. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my anchor in whatever storms may come? The answer came from her heart without hesitation. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Kenneth Flores, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the crew erupted in cheers. Frank Reyes produced a bottle of his finest rum, Scott began playing a lively tune on his concertina, and Joshua started planning a wedding feast that would be remembered in pirate legend for years to come. The wedding took place 3 days later on a secluded beach in the Bahamas, officiated by a retired priest who had once sailed with Henry Morgan and now lived as a hermit among the palm trees. Dorothy wore a dress of white silk that Kenneth had somehow acquired from a French merchant vessel, along with flowers woven into her hair by the island women who had befriended them. Kenneth stood beside her in his finest coat, his hair tied back with a ribbon Dorothy had embroidered with their initials. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through calm seas and storms alike, there wasn't a dry eye among the assembled pirates and islanders. I promise to be your harbor when the world becomes too much to bear, Dorothy said, her voice carrying clearly across the beach. And I promise to be your wind when you need to sail toward your dreams, Kenneth replied, his hand steady as he placed the ring on her finger. The celebration lasted until dawn, with music and dancing and stories shared around driftwood fires. But eventually the revelers began to drift away, leaving Kenneth and Dorothy alone on the beach as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. What happens now? Dorothy asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder as they watched the waves roll endlessly toward shore. Now we write our own story, Kenneth replied, his arm tightening around her waist. We sail where the wind takes us, help those who need help, and build a life that's ours alone. Dorothy smiled, thinking of all the adventures that lay ahead. They would face dangers and challenges, certainly. The British Navy would continue hunting them, other pirates would test Kenneth's resolve, and the sea itself would always be a fickle mistress. But they would face it all together as partners in every sense of the word. I love you, Captain Flores, she said, using his title with playful formality. And I love you, Mrs. Flora, he replied, the name sending a thrill through both of them. As they walked back toward the Serpent's Dream, hand in hand on the sand still warm from yesterday's sun, Dorothy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. Now she was a pirate's wife, a navigator, a healer, and a partner in one of the most unusual love stories the Caribbean had ever witnessed. The ship's crew was already preparing for departure, loading supplies and checking rigging with the easy efficiency of men who had found their calling on the open sea. They greeted their captain and his new wife with respectful nods and genuine smiles, accepting Dorothy not as an outsider but as family. Frank Reyes approached them as they reached the gangplank, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. The men are ready to sail, Captain. Where shall we set course? Kenneth looked at Dorothy, including her in the decision, as he had promised he always would. What do you think, love? Where should we go first as husband and wife? Dorothy considered their options, thinking of the maps they had studied together and the stories Kenneth had told her of distant islands and hidden treasures. But one destination called to her more than any other. The Amazon River, she said without hesitation. You said you always dreamed of exploring it. Kenneth's eyes lit up with surprise and delight. That's a dangerous journey. The river is full of rapids and hostile tribes, and the Spanish control most of the territory. Then it sounds like exactly the kind of adventure we should have, Dorothy replied with a grin that matched his own. The journey to South America took them through some of the most beautiful waters in the Caribbean, past islands where flamingos waded in crystal-clear lagoons and dolphins raced alongside their ship. Dorothy spent her days learning advanced navigation techniques from Scott Jimenez and her evenings in Kenneth's cabin, planning their route and discussing the challenges they would face. Their love continued to deepen with each passing day. Kenneth had been transformed by marriage, his natural reserve melting away as he shared more of himself with the woman who had become his anchor and his sail. Dorothy discovered new depths to her own courage and resourcefulness, finding that she could face any danger as long as Kenneth was beside her. They encountered other ships along the way, merchants and naval vessels and fellow pirates. But Kenneth's reputation for fairness and Dorothy's presence as his partner seemed to smooth their path. Word had spread throughout the Caribbean about the pirate captain who had married for love and the woman who had tamed his heart without breaking his spirit. When they finally reached the mouth of the Amazon, Dorothy stood at the ship's bow in wonder, watching the muddy waters of the great river mix with the blue of the Atlantic. The jungle stretched endlessly in both directions, a green wall that seemed to pulse with hidden life and ancient secrets. "Are you ready for this?" Kenneth asked, joining her at the rail. Dorothy took his hand, feeling the calluses that marked him as a sailor and the gentleness that marked him as the man she loved. "I've been ready since the day I walked into that tavern and asked a pirate for help." They sailed up the Amazon for 3 weeks, navigating by instinct and determination through waters no European ship had ever mapped. They encountered indigenous tribes who traded peacefully with them, exchanging European goods for fresh fruit and knowledge of the river's hidden channels. They saw birds with feathers like living jewels and fish that seemed to glow with their own inner light. But the greatest treasure they found was not gold or silver or precious stones. It was the confirmation that they could face anything together, that their love was strong enough to carry them through uncharted waters and unknown dangers. On their last night on the river before turning back toward the sea, Kenneth and Dorothy sat on the deck under a canopy of stars unlike any they had ever seen. The jungle around them hummed with nocturnal life, and the air was thick with the scent of flowers and rich earth. "Do you ever regret it?" Kenneth asked quietly. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Dorothy considered the question seriously, thinking of the woman she had been in Port Royal and the woman she had become on the deck of a pirate ship. "I regret the circumstances that forced me to leave," she said finally. "I regret that my husband's death left me with no choices. But I don't regret choosing you, choosing this life, choosing love over safety." Kenneth pulled her closer, his lips brushing against her hair. "I spent 3 years believing that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. You taught me that love is the only thing that makes life worth living." They made love that night under the Southern Cross, their passion as deep and mysterious as the river that carried them. And when morning came, they turned the serpent's dream toward home, carrying with them memories that would last a lifetime and the unshakable knowledge that they had found something rarer than any treasure. The return journey brought new adventures and challenges, but also a sense of completion that Dorothy had never experienced before. She was no longer running from her past or uncertain about her future. She was exactly where she belonged, with the man she loved, living a life that was entirely their own creation. They established a base on a small island in the Bahamas, building a house among the palm trees where they could rest between voyages. Kenneth continued his work as a pirate, but his methods evolved as Dorothy's influence grew. They became known throughout the Caribbean as protectors of the innocent, defenders of the weak, and champions of justice in a world where justice was often scarce. Dorothy learned to fight with sword and pistol, becoming as formidable in battle as she was gentle in peace. Kenneth learned to trust not just in his own judgment, but in the wisdom of partnership, making decisions with Dorothy that he would never have considered alone. Their crew became their family, bound together not just by shared danger, but by shared values and genuine affection. Frank Reyes delivered 3 babies on various islands. Scott Jimenez married a tavern keeper's daughter in Jamaica, and Joshua Rodriguez finally bought his farm, though he returned to sail with them every few months because he missed the adventure. Years passed like waves on the shore, each one bringing new experiences and deeper love. Dorothy and Kenneth aged together, their hair growing gray and their faces lined with laughter and sun, but their passion for each other never dimmed. They became legend in their own lifetime. The pirate captain and his lady who proved that even in the lawless waters of the Caribbean, true love could flourish and endure. When Kenneth finally decided to retire from piracy, hanging up his cutlass and furling the black flag for the last time, Dorothy was ready to embrace whatever came next. They had saved enough money to live comfortably, and their reputation ensured that they would always be welcome in ports throughout the Caribbean. They built a larger house on their island with a library for Kenneth's books and a workshop where Dorothy could continue her studies of navigation and astronomy. They welcomed visitors from around the world, sharing their stories and their wisdom with anyone who sought them out. But their greatest joy came from the simple pleasure of being together, of waking each morning beside the person who knew them better than anyone else in the world. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over waters they had sailed together for so many years. And Dorothy would remember the desperate woman who had once approached a pirate in a tavern, asking for help. She had found so much more than help. She had found home, adventure, purpose, and a love that had transformed them both into better versions of themselves. Kenneth had found peace with his past and hope for his future. Together, they had created a life that was uniquely theirs, built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the unshakable conviction that love was the greatest treasure of all. On quiet nights, when the wind was just right, they could still hear the sea calling to them, reminding them of all the adventures they had shared and all the storms they had weathered together. And Dorothy would take Kenneth's hand, feeling the familiar calluses in the wedding ring that had never left his finger, and know that she had made the right choice all those years ago when she decided to trust a pirate with her life and her heart. Their story became part of Caribbean folklore, told in taverns and around campfires wherever sailors gathered. But for Dorothy and Kenneth, it was never just a story. It was their life, their love, their legacy. It was proof that sometimes the most desperate circumstances can lead to the most beautiful destinations, and that true love can flourish even in the most unlikely places. The woman who had once trembled in fear had become a legend in her own right. The pirate who had forgotten how to trust had learned to love again. And together, they had written a story that would inspire dreamers and lovers for generations to come, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between two hearts that had found their way to each other across the vast and dangerous sea.